January 1835, Ohio River Country. Outside, 18 degrees below zero before sunrise, wind off the valley cutting through every gap in the logs. Inside Johann Bauer's one-room cabin, a massive stone fireplace 36 inches wide eats cord after cord of oak and hickory, yet gives little warmth back. Most settlers would just burn more wood, but Bauer, a Pennsylvania German smith who'd learned tricks in the old colonies, slides a black iron plate, 28 by 24 inches and 3/8 thick, behind the coals on low iron dogs, leaving a 1-inch air gap from the back wall. His neighbors watch from the doorway and snicker. They called it fool's tin. They said he'd be better off nailing a frying pan to the moon. Everyone knew the answer to winter cold: build bigger fires, burn more wood. While they were splitting their third cord of the month, Bauer was positioning what looked like scrap metal in his hearth. Then the hard freeze hit. 20 below for weeks. Rivers turned to shelf ice. Livestock froze in the fields. Standard stone hearths barely kept cabins in the high 40s, no matter how much wood you fed them. But that fool's metal sheet? It doubled the radiant heat. Bauer's cabin held the mid-50s on half the wood. Suddenly, neighbors weren't laughing. They were lingering in his doorway, soaking up warmth they couldn't get at home. What did this Pennsylvania smith understand about heat, metal, and frontier survival that everyone else had missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The iron arrived on Heinrich Vogel's wagon 3 days after the first hard frost, a 28 by 24-inch rectangle cut from a broken stove side, 3/8 thick and heavy enough that Bauer had to grip it with both hands. Vogel had knocked the scale off with coarse sand, leaving the metal dark but smooth, and he'd squared the edges clean with a file. "Cost you 2 bits and a favor come spring," the German smith said, hefting the plate from his wagon bed. "What that favor might be, we'll see when the time comes." Bauer examined the iron in the pale November light, running his thumb along the edges. He'd seen plates like this in Pennsylvania hearths, cast iron firebacks that reflected heat into parlors and kitchens, some decorated with dates and coats of arms, others plain as this one. The principle was sound. Metal heated faster than stone, radiated better than brick, and could throw warmth across a room instead of soaking it into cold masonry. His neighbors had never seen such a thing. Out here you built your firebox deep and wide, filled it with split oak, and burned through winter by the cord. The positioning required precision. Bauer cleared the cold ashes from his hearth and measured the back wall, 36 inches wide, 30 high, 20 deep. The plate would need to stand clear of the masonry, creating an air gap that would keep the metal from conducting heat straight into the stone foundation. Vogel had forged 2 iron dogs for the purpose, L-shaped stands that would hold the plate steady while leaving space for hot air to rise behind it. "Gap of 1 inch, maybe 1.5", Vogel advised, setting the dogs in place. "Air moves, metal stays hot, brick stays cooler. Simple as that." Elias Carter arrived while they were positioning the plate, stomping snow off his boots and shaking his head at the sight. Carter farmed the next ridge over, a second-generation settler whose stone hearth measured 4 feet across and ate wood like a hungry animal. "Iron in a fireplace," he said, crossing his arms. "What's next, Johann? Copper pots for chimney caps?" His laugh carried no warmth. Carter's cabin leaked heat through every gap in the chinking, and his answer was always the same: split more wood, build bigger fires, stack cordwood to the rafters if that's what winter required. "Works in the old country," Bauer replied, adjusting the dogs until the plate stood vertical, its bottom edge resting 2 inches above the hearth floor. "Seen it in Lancaster, seen it in Philadelphia. Cast iron mostly, with fancy patterns. This does the same job." He struck the metal with his knuckle, producing a deep ring. "Reflects heat instead of swallowing it." Carter wasn't convinced. "Waste of good iron. That plate could be horseshoes, could be plow points. Instead, you're decorating your fireplace like some city parlor." He gestured at the hearth, where the black metal stood like a stage backdrop behind the andirons. Fire belongs against stone. Always has. Always will. Margaret O'Rourke appeared in the doorway, drawn by the conversation. The Irish widow managed her own cabin a quarter-mile downstream, cutting and splitting her own wood with help from her two boys. She studied the setup with practical eyes, noting the gap behind the plate, the way it caught and reflected the pale light from the window. "How much did that iron cost?" she asked. "2 bits," Vogel answered. "But I got broken stove sides, plowbacks, sheet iron from wagon repairs. Not every piece needs to be this thick." He tapped the plate with his hammer. "1/4 inch would work, even heavy tin, if you keep the fire moderate." "And it works how?" O'Rourke moved closer, running her hand along the metal's surface. "Fire heats this instead of the stone?" Bauer nodded. "Fire heats both, but iron heats faster, radiates better. Stone soaks up heat and holds it in the wall. Iron throws it back at you." He pointed to the gap behind the plate. "Hot air rises through here, keeps the metal from conducting into the cold masonry. Metal stays hot, room gets more heat." Carter snorted. "Old wives' tales and city nonsense. You want warmth, you burn more wood. Simple as that." He turned toward the door, then stopped. "When that contraption fails to keep you warm, Johann, don't come begging for split oak. I warned you about fool's innovations." After Carter left, O'Rourke lingered, asking practical questions about installation, cost, and safety. Could the plate warp under high heat? Would it throw sparks? How much clearance did you need from the ember bed? Bauer answered each query with measured precision, explaining the physics in frontier terms. Hot metal radiates like a stovetop. Air gaps prevent heat loss to masonry. Proper clearance prevents damage from direct flame contact. "I might try this," O'Rourke said finally. "Got a stove side with a crack through the middle. Boys could help me set it up." She studied the installation once more, memorizing the details. "What's the worst that could happen? Pull it out if it doesn't work." Vogel packed his tools while Bauer prepared kindling for the first test fire. The plate stood ready, its dark surface waiting for heat. By evening, the whole arrangement would face its initial trial, not the desperate test of deep winter, but the steady burn of November nights when a degree or two of extra warmth meant the difference between comfort and endurance. Bauer struck a match to the shavings, watching flames catch and spread to the split hickory. The fire built slowly, yellow tongues licking at the seasoned wood, heat beginning to radiate outward into the 18 by 22-foot cabin. Within minutes, the iron began to warm. Within an hour, it would glow dull red in the darkness, throwing heat across the room like a second sun. The test had begun, but the proof would wait for January's bitter cold and the hard freeze that would separate smart preparation from stubborn tradition. The first fire revealed the mechanism in stages, each hour teaching Bauer something new about how metal and heat work together. As flames caught the seasoned hickory, the iron plate began absorbing radiant energy from the coal bed, its black surface warming faster than the surrounding stone. Within 20 minutes, Bauer could hold his hand 6 inches from the metal and feel distinct warmth radiating outward. The brick wall behind the plate, shielded by that crucial 1-inch air gap, remained noticeably cooler to the touch. Abijah Kent arrived the next morning to examine the installation, his trained eye noting details that escaped casual observers. The New England mason had lined fireplaces from Vermont to western Pennsylvania, working with everything from field stone to imported brick, and he recognized the iron plate as a practical substitute for more expensive improvements. "Smart fix," he said, running his fingers along the gap behind the metal. "Same principle as the shaped firebox, different execution." Kent explained the physics in terms frontier settlers could understand. Standard masonry hearths absorb tremendous amounts of heat energy, conducting it through thick stone walls and up cold chimneys where it disappeared into winter air. The iron plate intercepted much of that radiant energy before it reached the masonry, heating quickly to temperatures that could exceed 600 degrees at the coal bed. Once hot, the metal became a secondary heat source, re-radiating energy back into the room while the air gap behind it created a convective layer that prevented direct conduction into the stone. Temperature difference matters, Kent continued, positioning himself at various distances from the hearth. Your skin feels warmth based on radiant heat striking it, not just air temperature. That plate doubles the radiating surface area pointing into your cabin. He gestured toward the glowing metal, now cherry red along its bottom edge. Same fuel load, twice the effective heat source. The mason also noted opportunities for improvement. Kent suggested angling the side cheeks of the firebox inward by 11 to 14 degrees, creating a shallow funnel that would direct more radiant energy toward the seating area. This required thin split bricks dry-fitted against the existing stone, a technique borrowed from Count Rumford's designs that had revolutionized fireplace efficiency in better-funded homes. Not necessary for the plate to work, Kent clarified, but it amplifies the effect. Bauer tested the system methodically over the following weeks, recording observations with the precision of a man whose survival depended on accurate measurements. He positioned a brass and alcohol thermometer 6 feet from the hearth center line at sitting height, taking readings every hour during evening fires. Without the plate, his previous fires had struggled to raise room air above 48 degrees on cold November nights. With the iron radiating heat, the same fuel load consistently achieved 54 to 58 degrees, a gain that transformed the cabin from barely tolerable to genuinely comfortable. The fuel savings proved equally dramatic. Bauer had always burned roughly 3/4 of a cord per month during cold weather, splitting and hauling oak and hickory in loads that required full days of labor. With the plate reflecting heat back into the room rather than disappearing into masonry, he found himself reaching for the woodpile less frequently. Evening fires lasted longer on the same amount of fuel, coal beds retained useful heat for an additional 30 to 45 minutes, and the cabin held warmth well into the night without constant feeding. Kent demonstrated the improved burning technique that maximized the plate's effectiveness. Rather than building fires directly on the hearth floor, he constructed a shallow bed of split brick that raised the coal bed 1 to 2 inches higher, improving the line of sight between flames and the iron surface. Heat travels in straight lines, he explained, adjusting the fire until flames licked upward along the metal's face. Higher coal bed means more radiant energy hits your plate instead of the side walls. The safety considerations required constant attention. Kent showed Bauer how to maintain proper clearance between the ember bed and the plate's bottom edge, preventing direct flame contact that could warp the metal or create dangerous sparking. Weekly inspections revealed stress points where high heat might cause cracking, and Kent recommended keeping the chimney swept to prevent creosote buildup that could ignite and damage the installation. Margaret O'Rourke arrived the following week with her own salvaged stove side, a 26 by 24 inch piece with a hairline crack down one edge but otherwise sound. Kent helped her position the metal using stacked brick shims instead of forged dogs, creating the necessary air gap with materials she already possessed. Her installation lacked the precision of Bauer's setup, but within hours of lighting her first fire, O'Rourke reported the same dramatic improvement in radiant heat. "Feels like sitting near 2 fires instead of 1, she observed, settling into her usual chair 8 feet from the hearth. Previously, that distance had been uncomfortably cold, even with a roaring blaze. With the cracked stove side throwing heat back into the room, she could sit comfortably at the same spot while burning noticeably less wood. Her 2 boys, accustomed to huddling close to the flames on cold evenings, now had room to spread out and play without shivering. The mechanism's effectiveness became most apparent during the transition between day and night fires. Traditional stone hearths radiated stored heat for perhaps an hour after flames died to coals, then cooled rapidly as masonry conducted warmth into the foundation and surrounding earth. The iron plate retained useful heat much longer, glowing dull red in the darkness and continuing to warm the cabin well past midnight. This extended heating cycle meant fewer middle-of-the-night trips to the woodpile and more consistent temperatures through the coldest hours. By December's end, 3 more cabins on the ridge had installed some variation of the metal fireback system. Heinrich Vogel's forge produced iron dogs and fitted plates from salvaged materials, while Kent advised on proper installation and safe clearances. Each household reported similar results. doubled perceived heat at normal sitting distances, room air temperatures 6 to 12 degrees higher than previous winters, and fuel savings approaching one-third of their usual consumption. The principle had proven itself through measurement and repetition, transforming a frontier innovation into documented fact. But the ultimate test still waited in January's depths, when bitter cold would push every heating system to its limits and separate theoretical improvement from life-saving necessity. The cold wave struck on January 15th with the sudden brutality that frontier veterans recognized as potentially lethal. Morning temperatures plunged to 15 below zero, then 20 below by the second day, as an Arctic mass settled over the salvaged Ohio and Mississippi valleys like a weight that refused to lift. Rivers developed shelf ice thick enough to support loaded wagons. Livestock that survived the first night huddled in whatever shelter they could find, their breath forming ice crystals that hung in the still air. Travel became impossible except for the most desperate errands, and even seasoned woodsmen stayed close to their hearths. Bauer had prepared for this test with the methodical care of a man who understood that measurement meant survival. He positioned 2 brass and alcohol thermometers in his cabin, one at 5 feet height and 6 feet from the hearth center line to record seating temperature, another against the back wall opposite the fire to measure the room's coldest point. His woodpile stood stacked and seasoned, split oak and hickory cut to 18-inch lengths that would burn clean and hot. Most importantly, his iron plate waited behind the coals, positioned on its dogs with that crucial 1-inch air gap that had proven its worth through December's lesser cold snaps. The morning ritual began at 5 o'clock, when Bauer raked coals from the previous night's banked fire and fed them split kindling, then progressively larger pieces until flames filled the firebox. The iron plate, still warm from overnight retention, began glowing within minutes as radiant heat struck its surface. By 6:30, with outside temperatures at 18 below, his main thermometer registered 56 degrees at normal seating distance. The back wall thermometer showed 49 degrees, a remarkable achievement considering the single-wall log construction and minimal chinking. Elias Carter faced the same killing cold with traditional methods pushed to their absolute limits. His massive stone firebox, 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep, consumed split oak at a rate that alarmed even a man accustomed to heavy winter burning. Carter lit his fires an hour before Bauer, fed them continuously through the morning, and still struggled to raise his cabin's air temperature above 46 degrees at 6 feet from the flames. His back wall thermometer, positioned identically to Bauer's, rarely climbed above 41 degrees despite the constant feeding of seasoned hardwood. The fuel consumption differences became stark within 48 hours. Bauer's daily wood use averaged 60 pounds of split oak and hickory, carefully measured loads that sustained comfortable temperatures from morning lighting through evening banking. Carter burned through 85 to 90 pounds daily, nearly 50% more fuel to achieve inferior results. At that rate, Carter's winter woodpile would last perhaps 6 weeks instead of the 8 to 10 weeks his calculations had assumed. The mathematics of survival were shifting against traditional methods. Margaret O'Rourke's cracked stove-side proved itself during the 3rd night of the freeze, when temperatures dropped to 22 below and stayed there until dawn. Her salvaged metal, installed with brick shims instead of forged dogs, heated her 18 by 20-foot cabin to 54 degrees on daily fuel consumption that barely exceeded 55 pounds of split wood. The hairline crack in her iron made no measurable difference in performance, proving that even damaged metal could transform a heating system's effectiveness. The comfort distance measurements revealed the plate's most dramatic advantage. Carter had to sit 3 to 4 feet from his roaring fire to feel genuinely warm, and even then his back remained cold while his face nearly burned from direct flame exposure. Bauer could position himself 6 to 7 feet from his hearth and feel radiant warmth on all exposed surfaces, front and back, as heat reflected from the glowing iron filled the room's air. This meant his family could use the entire cabin during the coldest weather instead of huddling in a semicircle around the immediate fire zone. The coal bed longevity provided another crucial advantage during the crisis period. Traditional stone hearths absorbed so much heat energy that coal beds cooled rapidly once active flames died down, requiring frequent refeeding through the night to maintain any useful warmth. Bauer's iron plate, reaching 6 to 800 degrees at peak firing, continued radiating significant heat for 30 to 45 minutes after flames reduced to coals. This extended heating cycle meant longer sleep periods between firewood runs and more consistent temperatures during the vulnerable pre-dawn hours. By the fourth day of sustained bitter cold, the masonry durability differences became visible. Carter's unprotected stone back showed stress cracks from repeated thermal shock, and one section lost a fist-sized chunk of fieldstone, degrading both the firebox geometry and draft efficiency. The fallen masonry created dead air pockets that further reduced heat reflection, while the damaged surface absorbed even more energy into the cold foundation. Bauer's plate-protected bricks showed no spalling or cracking, maintaining optimal firebox shape and draft characteristics throughout the extreme temperature cycle. Heinrich Vogel documented the results with a blacksmith's eye for practical measurement. During his rounds to check on neighbors and customers, he carried a simple thermometer and recorded cabin temperatures at standardized distances from various hearth configurations. Unmodified stone hearths averaged 44 to 48 degrees at 6 feet during peak firing. Cabins with metal firebacks consistently achieved 54 to 58 degrees at the same distance in fuel load. The 10-degree difference represented the margin between endurance and comfort, between survival and genuine warmth. The community response shifted as quietly as snow accumulating on windowsills. Neighbors who had openly mocked Bauer's fool's tin in November now lingered in his doorway when making courtesy calls, soaking up radiant heat that their own cabins could not provide. Margaret O'Rourke's success with salvaged stove parts generated inquiries about scrap metal availability and installation techniques. Even Carter, stubborn in his adherence to traditional methods, began asking pointed questions about plate positioning and air gap requirements. The crisis had created an undeniable A/B test under conditions where failure meant genuine hardship or death. Mathematical precision stripped away opinions and prejudices, leaving only the stark comparison between methods that worked and methods that fell short. The iron plate had doubled effective heat output while reducing fuel consumption by 25 to 40%, transforming winter survival from desperate endurance into manageable routine. The mechanism's superiority was no longer theoretical. It was carved in ice, measured in degrees, and proven by the simple fact that some cabins stayed warm while others barely survived. The adoption spread with the quiet efficiency of proven knowledge passing between households that shared tools, labor, and survival techniques as matters of necessity rather than courtesy. By the end of January, Heinrich Vogel's forge had produced iron dogs for 6 different installations, each one fitted to salvaged metal that homesteaders had previously considered scrap. A 30-inch by 22-inch wagon tire steel patch, hammered flat and cleaned of rust, transformed the Kellerman cabin's heating efficiency within a single evening's trial. Jacob Muller's family installed a 26 by 24-inch stove side, salvaged from a broken box stove, positioning it with the same 1-inch air gap that Bauer had demonstrated. Sarah Jenkins, whose husband had died the previous spring, overlapped 2 sheet iron pans to create an improvised fireback that raised her cabin's mean radiant temperature by 4 to 7 degrees. Each installation followed the basic principles that Abijah Kent had refined through his masonry experience, but adapted to available materials and individual firebox dimensions. The Kellerman wagon steel required 3 brick shims instead of forged dogs, stacked carefully to maintain the critical air gap while supporting the heavier metal. Muller's stove side, being thinner than Bauer's original plate, heated faster but required more careful clearance from direct flame contact to prevent warping. Jenkins's overlapped pans created an uneven surface that disrupted smooth heat reflection, but still provided measurable improvement over bare masonry. The fuel logistics shifted across the entire ridge community as households discovered they could maintain comfortable temperatures on dramatically reduced wood consumption. Families that had planned to burn 1 full cord per month found themselves stretching 3/4 of a cord across the same period, freeing up labor for other winter survival tasks. The saved wood represented more than mere convenience. It meant fewer trips into the forest during dangerous weather, reduced risk of injury while splitting and hauling, and extended reserves that could carry households through unexpected cold snaps or late-season storms. Margaret O'Rourke documented the most precise measurements, recording daily fuel consumption and temperature readings with the methodical care of a woman whose survival budget allowed no waste. Her cracked stove side consumed 55 to 60 pounds of split hardwood daily to maintain 54 degrees at 6 feet from the hearth, compared to the 80 pounds she had burned the previous winter for inferior results. The 25-pound daily savings translated to one full cord stretched across 2 additional weeks, a crucial margin when spring arrival remained uncertain and wood piles dwindled. The masonry protection benefits became apparent as February's temperature swings subjected fireboxes to repeated thermal stress cycles. Traditional stone backs in unmodified hearths showed increasing damage from the expansion and contraction caused by extreme heat followed by freezing cold. Carter's firebox lost 3 more chunks of fieldstone, creating an increasingly irregular surface that disrupted proper heat reflection and allowed more energy to conduct into the cold foundation. In contrast, the metal plates absorbed and dissipated thermal stress while shielding the masonry from direct flame contact, preserving optimal firebox geometry throughout the winter's worst weather. Abijah Kent used the community's growing interest to demonstrate advanced techniques that further improved the basic iron plate system. Working with the Mueller family, he installed thin split bricks to angle their firebox cheeks inward by 12 degrees, creating a shallow funnel that directed radiant energy toward the seating area with measurably greater efficiency. The angled cheeks, combined with their salvaged stove side, raised their cabin's comfortable seating distance from 4 feet to nearly 8 feet from the flames, essentially doubling the usable living space during cold weather. The ember bed positioning technique that Kent had shown Bauer spread to other households as families discovered its impact on heat reflection. Rather than building fires directly on stone hearth floors, experienced users constructed shallow platforms of split brick or flat field stone that elevated coal beds 1 to 2 inches higher. This improved the line of sight between flames and iron plates, ensuring maximum radiant energy struck the metal surface instead of dispersing against side walls or disappearing up the chimney. Heinrich Vogel's business adapted to meet the growing demand for iron dogs, plate trimming, and installation advice. His forge produced L-shaped stands in various sizes, fitted to support everything from thin sheet iron to thick stove sides, each set carefully measured to maintain proper clearance and air gap requirements. Vogel also developed techniques for working with damaged or irregular metal, showing households how cracked stove parts could be positioned to minimize heat loss while maximizing radiative surface area. The community knowledge base expanded as each household contributed observations about their particular installation. The Kellermans discovered that their wagon steel plate performed better when burnished with coarse sand to remove rust and scale, creating a smoother surface that reflected heat more efficiently. Muller's family found that their thinner stove side required banking with smaller coal beds to prevent overheating and potential warping. Sarah Jenkins learned to position her overlapped pans with the smoother surfaces facing inward for optimal heat reflection. Safety protocols developed through shared experience and occasional mishaps that served as teaching moments for the entire community. Carter Williams, installing a salvaged plow mold board, positioned it too close to his ember bed and discovered the importance of maintaining adequate clearance when direct flame contact caused temporary warping. Margaret O'Rourke's boys learned proper ash removal techniques after accidentally disturbing the brick shims supporting their mother's cracked stove side, demonstrating why weekly inspections of support systems prevented dangerous failures. The economic transformation extended beyond fuel savings to encompass the entire winter survival equation. Families spending less time cutting, splitting, and hauling wood could devote more labor to other essential tasks, repairing equipment, maintaining livestock shelter, preserving food stores, and crafting items for trade or use. Women found they could position looms, spinning wheels, and handwork stations farther from hearths without sacrificing comfort, expanding their productive workspace during the season when indoor crafts provided both necessity and income. By March's arrival, 8 cabins on the ridge had installed some variation of the metal fireback system, creating a documented case study in how practical innovation spread through frontier communities. The installations represented an investment in proven technology that cost minimal cash outlay while providing measurable returns in comfort, fuel efficiency, and survival margin. The method had transformed from Johann Bauer's ridiculed experiment into accepted practice, vindicated by mathematical precision and replicated through shared knowledge that enhanced every household's chances of surviving the next hard winter. The vindication arrived on a February night when nature delivered its final test in the form of a late-season blizzard that caught the Hendricks family on the trail 3 miles from home. Thomas Hendricks had taken his wife and 2 children to the settlement for supplies that couldn't wait, gambling that they could outrun the weather that had been threatening for 2 days. They lost that gamble when the wind picked up at dusk and snow began falling in thick, heavy flakes that obscured familiar landmarks within minutes. By full dark, with temperatures dropping toward 20 below and visibility reduced to arm's length, Hendricks made the decision that saved his family's lives. He turned toward the orange glow that marked Johann Bauer's cabin windows. Bauer opened his door to find 4 figures covered in snow and ice, their faces numb with cold and their clothing stiff with frost. Without ceremony or explanation, he ushered them inside where his iron plate glowed cherry red behind a bed of hickory coals, radiating heat that filled the 18 by 22-foot space with genuine warmth. The cabin held 58 degrees at 6 feet from the hearth, warm enough that the children could remove their outer clothing and sit comfortably while their parents thawed frozen fingers and toes. Bauer built up the fire with 2 armloads of split wood, and the metal plate responded immediately, throwing increased heat across the room while maintaining the steady, even warmth that had proven itself through the winter's worst cold. The Hendricks family spent the night in conditions that would have been impossible in a traditional stone hearth cabin during such weather. The iron plate continued radiating significant heat even after flames died to coals, maintaining comfortable temperatures through the pre-dawn hours when outside temperatures reached their lowest point. Thomas Hendricks, a practical man who had initially dismissed the metal sheet as unnecessary innovation, found himself studying the installation with new attention, noting the air gap behind the plate, the steady glow of the metal, and the way heat filled spaces that would have remained cold in his own cabin. Morning brought clear skies and the kind of brutal cold that followed major storms, with temperatures at 24 below and wind that made exposed skin dangerous within minutes. As the Hendricks family prepared to leave, Thomas asked the question that Bauer had been expecting since November. Where does a man find iron like that? The inquiry carried no trace of the mockery that had characterized earlier conversations about firebacks and metal plates. Survival had a way of stripping away prejudice and focusing attention on what actually worked. Bauer's response established the template for knowledge transfer that would define the innovation's spread beyond their immediate community. He explained the basic requirements without technical jargon: metal thick enough to withstand high heat, positioned with adequate air gap to prevent direct conduction, supported securely but removably for cleaning and maintenance. He recommended Heinrich Vogel's forge for iron dogs and plate preparation, Abijah Kent for installation advice, and suggested starting with salvaged materials to test the principle before investing in custom metalwork. The community adoption accelerated through the spring and following summer as word spread along trade routes and family networks that connected scattered settlements across the Ohio River country. Traveling merchants carried descriptions of the iron plate technique to distant cabins, while circuit preachers and itinerant craftsmen observed installations firsthand and replicated the method in new locations. Margaret O'Rourke's brother, visiting from Kentucky, installed a similar system using a broken plow mold board and reported similar fuel savings and comfort improvements in his own household. Heinrich Vogel's business evolved to meet demand that extended far beyond the local ridge community. His forge produced iron dogs in standardized sizes that traveling merchants could carry as trade goods, along with detailed instructions for proper installation and safety precautions. Vogel also developed techniques for retrofitting existing fireplaces with minimal masonry work, showing how iron plates could be installed in established cabins without major reconstruction. The Blacksmith's Ledger recorded sales of fireplace hardware to settlements as distant as Indiana and western Pennsylvania, evidence of the technique's geographic spread. The method's integration into frontier building practices represented its most significant long-term impact. New cabin construction increasingly incorporated design elements that optimized iron plate performance. Fireboxes sized to accommodate standard metal dimensions, hearth floors built with proper elevation for coal bed positioning, and chimney designs that accounted for the improved heat retention and reduced draft requirements. Abijah Kent developed plans for combination systems that integrated angled cheeks, central fireplace positioning, and iron plate installation into comprehensive heating solutions for frontier homes. Documentation of the technique appeared in practical guides and correspondence that preserved technical details for future generations. Circuit riding preachers recorded the method in journals that tracked innovations across their territories, while territorial land agents noted the iron plate installations in property descriptions and settlement reports. Margaret O'Rourke maintained detailed fuel consumption records that provided quantitative proof of the system's efficiency, measurements that convinced skeptical neighbors and validated the technique's claims of 25 to 40% wood savings. The economic transformation reached beyond individual households to affect regional timber consumption and trade patterns. Communities that adopted iron plate heating reduced their collective wood consumption by measurable percentages, extending forest resources and reducing the labor required for fuel gathering. This freed up manpower for other essential tasks: land clearing, crop production, livestock management, and craft specialization that strengthened local economies and improved living standards across entire settlements. The cultural shift proved equally significant as the technique transitioned from ridiculed innovation to accepted practice. What neighbors had mocked as fool's tin became standard equipment that sensible homesteaders installed as routinely as they chinked gaps or banked foundations. The iron plate joined the pantheon of frontier necessities: axes, rifles, plows, and other tools that separated successful settlers from those who failed to adapt their methods to American conditions and available materials. The legacy endured through multiple generations as sons and daughters inherited both the physical installations and the technical knowledge required to maintain and replicate them. Family correspondence from the 1850s and 60s referenced iron plates and firebacks as established features of well-managed households, while estate inventories listed metal heating equipment alongside other valuable property. The technique had evolved from desperate winter expedient to permanent fixture of frontier domestic architecture, its principles integrated into the accumulated wisdom that defined successful homesteading in pre-industrial America. Modern recognition of the innovation appeared in museum collections and historical site interpretations that preserve both artifacts and documented accounts of iron plate installations. Building historians noted the technique's influence on later heating developments, tracing connections between frontier firebacks and the cast iron stoves that eventually replaced open hearth cooking and heating. The method represented more than mechanical innovation. It embodied the frontier principle that survival rewarded those who adapted proven techniques to local conditions, discarded ineffective traditions, and measured results with the mathematical precision that distinguished success from failure in environments where both were matters of life and death.